This is a culmination of my decade-long study of astrology. I've done charts pretty much every day for a decade, uh, read some of the best resources out there, um, which is a work in and of itself because um, there's a lot of crap out there too. And I've connected with who I see were some of the best um, astrologers who had decades of experience with this, and a couple of them have passed away. So this is kind of carrying the torch forward, and so yeah, we'll have this for posterity, I guess. Um, what you see in front of you is a circle, and it's kind of like a clock, right? It's got these hash marks on it, kind of like you might say like seconds on a watch. And there are 360 hash marks. You'll see that they're kind of demarcated into little slices, almost like a pie. And those slices have the names of the zodiac signs in them. Well, there are 30 hash marks within each slice, again, bringing you to 360 total. There are 12 slices, 12 months. That's almost like a 365 day calendar. The reason for these hash marks are is that the sun moves roughly, not exactly, because remember we have 365 days a year, not 360, roughly one of these a day, circling the entire clock. And that is the solar calendar. That is what makes up the zodiac. That is the base reality. And so the circle is time. That's what the circle is. And but you can put planets at any one of these points. And because they're in the context of the circle, they're going to be in a mathematical relationship to each other. They could be at a 90-degree angle, or they could be at a 120-degree angle. You can slice it up any way that you like. And what they're doing as they move around this, we'll call this base reality that's set out by the sun, and we'll come back to the sun. The sun is very important for why is the sun the base reality for this circle, which is time. But we'll get to that. Anyways, you put planets on here, and they're in a mathematical relation to each other as they move around at differing speeds. And they're marking time because it's a clock. And these aspects are mathematical. Time is immaterial. It's a thing in the mind, really. It's these mathematical relations. You can't touch them. They're numbers, but they're immutable, like numbers are. 2 + 2 will always equal 4, right? And so, but what is that? What is all of this business of planets kind of having relationships to each other over this base reality? Well, I've come to see that as a story. And it's interesting, the sun, this is where we're at, right now. The sun has just entered Pisces, and the astrological calendar of the solar calendar starts every year at Aries, around March 21st every year. That story just kind of repeats every year, but not every year's a feast, not every year's a famine. It's, sometimes it's just like in between. It's It's a mix of things. Every year is kind of different. And that's kind of what the story, the story is being told through the other planets. They interact with the sun too. They make mathematical aspects to that sun. And, but that story, because the amount of time that we're dealing with is infinite. It's never going to really run out. This is eternal. There is an end and a beginning, but a circle, not like a line or an arrow, as some people describe time. It's a continuum. And so there's an eternal story being played out. An eternal story. Well, no one really lives to be eternal. So you have to set up generations, and you have to have some kind of culture. You have to have a son or a daughter who's going to, because, you might walk into the story at the beginning, but you're going to pass away before it concludes. So to make sure the story is understood and told, you're going to rely on successive generations. Well, that's very interesting. Well, okay, so there's a story being told, and it's being told across eternity. What is that story? Well, I think it's the story of us, of who we are. Well, who is we? Well, that's a good question too. You see this intro video, we're really getting down to the most basic parts. What is astrology? What is it for? What can it do? What are the component parts? So we have to answer these questions. Well, we know the circle is time, and we know that there's a story being told in time, in numbers, let's say, mathematical relations. It's being told across time too. Well, we need to know not only what the story is about, but who it's for and how they're going to make sense of it and what that means to make sense of it. So let's talk about space. Space is the material crystallization of time. We talk about these things planets having mathematical relations that are all contextualized in the circle. And so that there's a unity to time, and that unity facilitates the notion of eternity. It's circle, right? But there's also a unity to material space, because things are in relation to each other in material space too, right? I've got a T to my left in arm's reach, and then kind of out of arm's reach to my right, there's a potted plant. These things are in relation to me in 3D space. Well, material planets, because there are balls of gas out there. That's what Saturn and Jupiter are. They're material crystallizations of time, of these mathematical stories that are being played out. And your body is a material crystallization of time too. And we can say even further than that. If there's a unity in time, there's likely a unity in space. And so when we say the planets are a material crystallization of time and your body is a material crystallization of time, how is your body really any different from the planets? And that's why I'm really averse to the idea that planets are doing something to you as if you're separate from them, right? Saturn's doing this. Oh, I lost my job. I'm very skeptical of that view of astrology. And, it's kind of like, I guess, a bit of a hippie notion, right? If there's unity in material space, we are all one in that sense as well. But I really think it's important to go back to the idea that there's no separation between you and the planets. Because we have to ask, what does this mean that there is a material crystallization of time? What does that mean? You hear these phrases, as above, so below, from sky to ground. It's kind of like pop culture astro quips. But there's something to that, because there's an interface happening between the clock or the circle and the relations and the story happening there in math and the material crystallization in space. They aren't the same thing, but they're interfacing, and that's really important, because understanding that they aren't the same thing and that they're interfacing really helps you understand the idea that you aren't separate from the planets. Because planets, if we're understanding that, and rewind that, if you kind of need to listen to that a couple of times, understanding that, you realize that planets are organs of your consciousness, like a stomach, a brain, and a heart. We all have those, right? But we aren't those individually. They all work together to make a living state. You are in a living state if you have all those and they're working in concert. And that's what the material planets are doing, is that they're all separate from each other, but they're all interacting with each other, and they're creating a living state. And that is backed up and mapped on to the circle of time. Well, what is that living state? What is that supra-organism that it gives rise to? That's consciousness. That's the content. That's the interface between the circle of time and the crystallization of space. It's called consciousness. And you are one slice of that eternal consciousness rendered in material space in an individual body, because that's all a birth chart is just a snapshot of the dance, of the story. Well, you've got to figure that story out. And then you're around other people who also have their own story. And now you're starting to understand how astrology serves kind of like a mythological function or a storytelling function. What the heck are we doing here? Who are we? What are our capabilities? Why are we on this planet? These big questions. Well, that's what astrology is all about, and that's what all this talk about time and space is trying to get around. Let me pause here for a second and look at my notes. Planets, okay, they're organs of your consciousness. They are interacting with each other on a material plane, and that material plane is interfacing with how math is interacting on the plane of time. And that interface is consciousness, and you have access to that interface, we'll say. And that consciousness, that's all your thoughts, your emotions, your impressions, your perceptions, your physical sensation. And these are, you can even, if you really want to simplify it, that mess of things that I just kind of spat out, that's hands on the watch. If you really feel more comfortable understanding it in those terms. Here's something that's really interesting, though. If the human, and then we get into these terms, soul or spirit, that is crystallized in a body, is the access point for the interface between the time plane and the space plane. That's not exactly, we talk about consciousness being these feelings and these thoughts and these perceptions and such. Well, that's not exactly what decisions are. And this is a really key point in understanding the interface and how humanity is plugged into that interface, because they're not merely plugged into it. Humanity is kind of, we'll say, managing or governing that interface, that communication between those two planes. And the communication is altered through things like, we'll say, awareness or consciousness, um, also known as decisions, um, free will. Because a lot of the things we've been talking about up until this point are pretty deterministic, pretty cyclical, we'll say. What decisions or free will is that it's an expression of the material crystallization that that you are all one with, because we're all making decisions in this material space that we're all one with. I walk out my door right now, I turn a key and the motor starts and I can drive to a grocery store. And that is available potential energy around me. I can get up and I can fall down on the floor. That's potential energy in my material space. These decisions are expressions of these material potentialities that are talking to a plane of time that sets up a certain, we'll say, certain deterministic edge. I can't get up and go to like a place in the world where internet doesn't exist. I know I can like go to Antarctica or whatever, but the fact is that we live in a historical stage, is what I'm saying, when the internet exists. Unless I was able to travel back in time, the deterministic edge of the historical stage that I'm at means that I was born and I live in an era when the internet exists. It's not like I was born in the Civil War and we're all walking around in a completely analog reality. And so, there are limited variables that this clock creates, but there are potentialities in the material world that can create a lot of variations on how that gets expressed. And the human capacity for free will pulls that clock, we'll say, into being. And that's why reality is not really fate and it's not really free will. And that's why astrology is not like, oh, this is, I see it in the stars, this is guaranteed to happen in this precise exact way. Because what you're doing as a human, as the interface between the space plane and the time plane, as the messenger, as the relayer of these two energies, is that, this kind of sets the tempo here. The clock does, but you, as the person who's in a unified field with the space plane, I mean, you can do anything, and that's going to, well, within reason, right? And that's going to affect how the mathematical relations on this watch play out. And so the determinism almost has to respond to your free will. And so what a decision is, or what an expression of the material plane is, like when if I stood up right now and I fell down on the floor, I sprinted out my front door, whatever, that's like working out a math problem. This is all math problems, this immutable realm of time. And so as the story continues, because it's always happening every moment, it has to acknowledge that. It has to acknowledge that on February 19th, 2021 at 8:30 at night on the East Coast, I sprinted out my front door. It has to account for that. And so, that's how history is made. We live in a reality where, the Confederacy lost the Civil War. We live in a reality um, where the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, right? We don't live in a reality where the atomic bomb was never dropped. We don't live in a reality where the South won the Civil War. Those parallel realities might have been existing or do exist, or potentialities in this realm of the time plane. But since humans are interfacing with that in the plane of space, it creates like, it's almost like, like there's tracks on a train where it just kind of like shunts it onto a particular track. It almost kind of beats determinism at its own game. That's what free will does, is it kind of like limits how this can be expressed in a way. That's kind of like the purpose of humanity, is that it really throws this Promethean wrench in the deterministic clock by saying, well, yes, I see the potential energy that you have, just like there's potential energy. I can go out to my truck right now and start it up, but I'm going to do this. I'm going to drop an atomic bomb on Nagasaki. I'm going to make this decision in this war, and then the South will lose. And so that's how humanity gets implicated in this story, and that's why the story needs humanity. It just can't planets dancing out there mathematically on their own. It's just really, what's the point of that? So you can act, and see, this is why astrology is really, it's like it's like a moral, ethical paradigm. If your decisions are much like working out a math problem and managing that interface between the time plane and the space plane, you can act in harmony with what's outlined here, and it all flow nicely and construct a reality in harmony with what the potential there is in terms of the math. And you have these flourishing golden age periods, or you have you can even act in creative dissonance with it, and that's really interesting too. You get it, where I think that's kind of what we're in now, where we had a certain idea of where things were headed with the election, and it didn't quite work out as we had perhaps predicted, and it's a good cautionary tale. But the trajectory is still par for the course, and I think that's worth noting, and that's why I think we're still investigating astrology and how that works with us as a human species. So you can act in creative dissonance to the potential in the time plane, and that has its own interesting implications for material reality. Everything's so quite absurd now at the material level of our world, because we're kind of living in creative dissonance with it. That's the decision we've made. That's fine. We have that free will. And you can act in total dissonance to it too, and that's when you get really, really bad situations, kind of like the Dark Ages. And let's bring it back to this point. If you're acting more in harmony with it, it's more not a dark age, it's more of an awakening, an enlightenment, right? We talk about enlightenment in the woo-woo community. It's being enlightened people, or the Renaissance, right? And that's why, astrology, to really understand it, requires a certain moral acceptance or a certain ethical stance that you are a drop in the cosmos, and it requires a certain humility to understand that. really kind of guard against those tyrannical impulses, thinking, well, I just run this show. We're just monkeys on a rock out here flying around in space. Well, you can run on that platform. I wouldn't recommend it. Um, what else do we have here? Yeah, I mean, space and free will and individual consciousness, that whole plane, that whole material crystallized plane. It's subject to physical laws, unlike this clock. It's not subject to those laws, and so it's a different sandbox. And as humans being interfacing between those two sandboxes, yeah, I mean, you can degrade the material form or you can uplift it in ways, and you can't really alter that immutable clock of time. And what you can do is, by degrading or uplifting the material plane, you can play in tempo with the rhythms and the mathematical relations here. You can play in counterpoint. That's the whole magic and mystery, I suppose, of the human story. Astro does. I would suppose it's a prescriptive system in that way, though, because if you are, as we go back to our early metaphor, the son or the daughter of someone who's been part of a successive story of us, of your biological family, of your human family, you kind of have a duty, I think, to try to work as much in harmony or in creative dissonance, even with the clock here, and just have this creative explosion called life, really try to maximize that expansiveness and avoid states of ignorance, which is suffering, right? That's the whole Buddhist idea. So yes, if you're part of the successive chain of ancestors, and you want to work in concert with this story, and that's why I think always the story is something that, while there are there are some really dark things about astrology, there are some really difficult things that really take you into the depths of humanity. I think ultimately what the story is there is, we're saying it's the story of us and how it's worked out through things like free will. It wants to be a really vital living moment. I don't know if I can go so far as to say is if it has a benevolent sense of wanting the best for you. I'm trending in that direction. I suppose there's a lot to investigate. It takes a lot of time to arrive at that conclusion, but I think it does, we can look at it more in a Nietzschean sense, that it does seek like a full expression, that burst of life, that raw will to power that celebrates and protects life. In terms of, when I say protects life, it wants another generation. It wants a new generation. It doesn't want it like in the human story. It wants to create beautiful art, beautiful architecture, beautiful biological families, what have you, beautiful businesses, towns, and such. And so, that's the potential that it gives you. I never really see in astrology like endless destruction. It's cyclical, right? It's a circle. There's creation followed by destruction followed by creation, or creative destruction, right? So being able to work with that is part of the the meaning of life. Just try to pursue the thread of life, pursue the thread of that burst of vital creativity in the moment of being in a total living state, as we're saying. Things are not just discrete objects, they're all working together, on the time plane, on the material plane, in your physical body. That's what consciousness is. It wants that, just that vital yes, right? Of all things, just accepting all things. Because, there's always a little bit of good shaded in with bad. It's a gestalt. It's a story, right? It's a story's a little bit of good and a little bit of bad. That's why we're drawn to stories. So, you can look at it in this way. When your birth chart, and this is just the solar calendar, this is not someone's birth chart or a chart of a company or a nation or whatever, because it's a snapshot in that dance on the clock. Your consciousness isn't really owned by you. It's a snapshot slice from the eternal ribbon of time crystallized in your body. And it's made into an experience of individual consciousness on a material plane. And you can rewind and go back and listen to that monster slang, but that's the idea, is that your consciousness isn't really owned by you. Your crystallization of an eternal ribbon of consciousness is what allows you to interface. It's your unique perspective, right, that allows you to interface between the material plane or the space plane and the time plane, and to kind of beat determinism at its own game, because your unique perspective allows you to work out that math problem in real time. That decision allows that free will to enter the equation and work out that potentiality in a very unique way. I'm a kind of an introverted, shy kind of guy. Other people are very extroverted. We all have these very unique ways in which we kind of tweak reality. So that's the fun of it, even though, your consciousness is kind of on leash to this. Rather, it can almost seem like you're doomed to the clock. Your consciousness is leashed to it. Well, that's a whole nother conversation about the afterlife and all that. I'm not going to get into that. We can say one last thing before I wrap up this little intro, and got plenty to talk about, so I don't want to overload too much in this first one. When planets, because they continue to transit on this clock, they are transiting also against your snapshot, your birth chart. So not only are they communicating with each other in real time all the time, the way that they're communicating with each other, you can superimpose that on your birth chart, and they're communicating with your chart. So, there's a macro story happening now, and then it's like, how do you fit into that macro story according to that unique individual consciousness we've just been talked about? We might say it's your role in the zeitgeist. Well, as planets continue to transit against that map or that snapshot of your blueprint, your consciousness is just unfolding like an eternal rose with infinite petals, right? Because really it's nothing new. Your snapshot, that little slice from the ribbon of eternity that is you can't change that, right? So life is really just a continual revelation of who you are. You become who you are. Well, that sounds all kind of like, really like the rarefied air philosophy. You're probably sitting there and saying like, well, then why do you even do anything? Well, it's up to you to see this continual revelation of your own consciousness as like a pulling back of the veil, as seeing like what this whole interface is about, of seeing how free will can beat determinism at its own game in a way. And so we all, regardless of the historical stage that we're born in and of the constraints of our lifespan, however long each of us happens to live, and our experience of this clock, we all have a very unique privilege in understanding the human condition. We all have a unique vantage point on that, and we see it through how the transiting planets in real time impact our individual birth chart. And so while, there's a particular story, right now, I think, for all of our lifetimes, it's going to be about what does it mean to have lived and died in the digital era? Someone else who lived in another time didn't really deal with that particular story. But, we're still connected to again, because it's generational, we're still connected to primitive man because we're part of this eternal ribbon. So, while we're working out weird things like how we're going to do digital currencies and whatnot, we're still asking the big questions. What does it mean to love? What does it mean to have a family? What does it mean to be this like weird thing of having being in a material body and an isolated consciousness, but knowing that you have access to the great source, the great clock of time. What does that mean? And so, yeah, I mean, over life, you just continually become who you are, and the planets just trigger and give you more opportunities to have revelations of your consciousness. Kind of a hard thing to say there. Revelations of your consciousness, revelations of the zeitgeist of your role in, in the particular generation you've been born in. But, it's really also a chance to understand the great story, the eternal story, the big questions, right? What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be stuck in that interface between the space plane and the time plane? That sounds pretty fun to me. That's pretty exciting. There's real magic in that. Some of those questions will never be answered, but that's the labor, right? And bring the Buddhist thing back in here. That's the karma. Karma's work. That's the work. That's the labor. That's the working out of the math problem, as we've been saying. That's the work of having to make a decision, of having to enact that free will, which is the working out of the math problem of the potentiality, of having to say, well, I'm going to do this, I'm going to found this business, or I'm going to create this work of art, or I'm going to travel to this far off place. It's all a great adventure to understand not only who you are and not only your role and the particular zeitgeist you live in, but what is this clock all about? This unending story, these big questions. How the heck are we out here floating around? These things, Saturn, like what the heck, a ringed planet, like who would have thought? Very strange, right? So, astrology is really about being able to make peace, I'd say, with the question of meaning, because that's what we all want to know, right? What is the meaning of life? And so now we have some ground rules, and I look forward to the next one with you guys. Thanks for listening.